Welcome to Kiffin's Keep, an intellectual resource for the pillar and buttress of the truth, which is the church. This is a project of the London Lyceum, which is all about serious thinking for a serious church. I'm Jordan Stefaniak, host of Kiffin's Keep and president of the London Lyceum. And as always, I'm excited to be here with you all today. In today's episode, I will be covering the doctrine of real relations. What are they? What does it mean? And yeah, so it's gonna be a lot of fun. So before we get started, remember to like the video if you enjoyed the content, if you learned something new, or if you found that it was terrible, go ahead and hit the like button anyway, just because you're a cool guy or gal. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of the great content that we are producing here. It also does help us get our content out to more people so that they can engage the material as well. And do go ahead and drop a comment if you agree, disagree, you have other thoughts, ideas, resources, whatever it may be, drop a comment. I appreciate the support. Now, in this particular episode, I said I was going to cover the doctrine of real relations. So I'm doing that in part because this is like an evergreen topic. If you want to think about classical theism or just theism in general, the doctrine of real relations ends up getting brought up. And I'm using that terminology of doctrine. It's not really a doctrine. It's more, real relation is sort of like a term of art. It has a very specific meaning, and I'm going to get to that in a minute. But it ends up causing all sorts of confusion because there is a very specific technical meaning for what a real relation is in the medieval and scholastic literature that doesn't transfer to what we think of real relation today. So I think today, oftentimes when I think of a real relation, if I ask somebody what the real relation is, they would say, I'm really related to my grandmother, I'm not adopted, or I'm really related to this hot dog that I just ate, whatever it may be. I mean, there's all sorts of different examples that you could give. We could say that seems like really being really related. I love somebody, I'm really related to them, etc. Now, the reason I mention that again is because this was brought up once again in a debate between Gavin Ortland and Ryan Mullins. I have not watched the debate, to be completely honest. I simply listened to a podcast review from Ryan Mullins and Chad McIntosh and Andrew Hollingsworth, and they were mentioning this piece again, where it seems to be another common, just skirmish. There were debate, and I think there continues to be problematic misunderstanding. We talk past one another when we talk about real relations. So let me cash out how I think of a real relation as in its medieval context and how it's usually technically used in theological literature. Though people don't have the people who don't have the background in the medieval literature and the scholastic literature are going to end up making mistakes, even if it ends up causing problems. So I tend to want to avoid the terminology of real relation just because I think it is more confusing than it is helpful, because you have to know all this background material to be able to distinguish appropriately. So I think in an essay that I co-wrote with Andrew Hollingsworth, ironically, we disagree on some fundamental issues, but we agree on some things and we can work together on those things. That's cool. I think we should have more of that. Andrew's smarter than me, so that's always helpful. But in this essay, I tried to cash out two senses of real relation. One sense of real relation, which is more lightweight, metaphysically lightweight, and you see this commonly, I think, more commonly used in philosophical literature, in contemporary literature anyway. And then you have this more heavyweight real relation version, which I think is the more like medieval usage that you are seeing in scholastic writing and later, where it talks about real relations. What are they denying or what are they affirming? And it's referring to this more heavyweight concept. If you want to read more about this, I mean, the classical place to start would be Thomas Aquinas, where he walks through a couple of different options in his framework for a logical, or a what's the other word? It's conceptual, or a mixed relation. I think that is in one of the first questions of the Summa, maybe 12 or 13, somewhere in there. I think you can get it in the really affordable, nice Hackett paperback set, because they haven't translated everything, but they've done a couple of important sections, and I think they've got one on that from like questions 1 to 13 or something. But I think it's there. I would encourage you to go check it out, read that. There's other sort of older scholastic-y metaphysics introductions that would engage this question as well. So I think it's Jesse Owens. Yeah, I think it's Jesse Owens where he has like an introduction to Christian metaphysics or something, where he tries to walk through this, and I think he's really helpful. I also try to walk through this a little bit, not only in that essay that I wrote that I mentioned, which I'll drop a link to it, but I think you have to purchase it or something if you don't have institutional access. Um, but I also have a forthcoming book sometime, I hope later this year, and then you can pick that up, and I try to walk through some of this in a little bit more detail. So enough ground clearing. I'm going to say that a real relation in this lightweight format would just simply say that this thing A is related to this thing B. You know, we could say Gandalf is related to Frodo in some way. We could say he's taller than Frodo. He has grayer hair than Frodo. There's this relation between them of some sorts. And I'm not getting into all the debates and complex debates about just relations in general, which you could go 100 different directions with the contemporary debates on relations, and even the older, Aristotelian debates about relations and things. You can go in a lot of different directions. So we're just sticking with this. The second condition for this lightweight sort of real relation would be these two things, say Gandalf and Frodo, are really distinct, non-identical extramental things. So naturally, Frodo and Gandalf are different things. In that sense, you could say that satisfies a lightweight sort of real relation. Gandalf is really related to Frodo in the fact that he's taller than Frodo. But there doesn't have to be any sort of ontological bits in Gandalf that's really like grounding this relation. It just kind of exists in virtue of the fact that these two objects exist, and there's nothing ontologically nefarious going on here that would cause Gandalf to gain an accidental property of some sort. And so, in the same sense, that it's not problematic for God, because what ends up happening here is the classical tradition, by and large, is going to want to say no real relations for God, because that could be problematic for his simplicity or his immutability and things, because it's supposed to think that if God had a real relation, then he has accidental properties, which is going to violate some different aspects of who God is, classically speaking. And so that's why we want to deny it. But if you're using real relations in this lightweight way, there's no problem for God in my mind. You can use real relations and God can have real relations with the world, and that's totally fine. And I think that tracks better with most people's natural intuitions when they first hear it. Is God really related to the world? Yes, he is. Of course, he created the world. He loves the world. He loves people. He answers prayer. He does all these things. So of course, he's really related. But there's this equivocation that goes on between these two things, because there's this classical term of art, real relation, which I'm going to get to this extra condition that would really give you that heavyweight sense. And what ends up happening in these discussions is it transfers from no real relation like this, and then that's the really weird consequence that God's not really related to the world. Well, there's an equivocation of the terminology here between real relation and really related. So we're using English words in very different senses there when we move from that first sentence to the second sentence, which I think is where the locus of the problem ends up being. We make this transition from this one language to this other language, a technical concept, to more general, generic, like I just am related in the sense that I love something or I care about something. And of course, the classical tradition is going to want to say, yes, God has no real relations in this very technical sense, but he also really loves the world. He really is the creator. Now, get into the, some people are going to try to like sidestep some of the, he doesn't gain an accidental property of being creator, and you can do different sort of metaphysical ways to explain that. Some are going to say he's eternally creator. Others, I think, are just going to say that the creator is not the sort of property that's going to add some ontological bit to you. But that's a little bit too technical, I think, potentially for these sort of videos that I'm producing here. So I'm going to leave that aside and just say, for the medieval sense of a real relation, you're going to have not only this one and two thing where Gandalf is related to Frodo and Gandalf is not identical to Frodo, but also the fact that there's a real extramental foundation in Gandalf for this relation to Frodo. And so I guess an example that I could give is that the lightweight version, it could be like when I became a father. So when my son, or whenever, I guess my oldest son, that's when I really became a father. The other times I already am a father. But when he comes through the birth canal and he's born and I magically become a father, I don't add any new ontological bit to me. There's no accidental property that's going to suddenly inhere in me. It's just, I think that's just the way it, like there, that's in a lightweight sense. I'm becoming father, though I'm not adding something. Versus, so there's nothing like intrinsic to me, right? That's making this shift. There's something extrinsic that's occurring that's causing me to accrue this property of father. And I don't think that is problematic for God to say that once creation happens, it's something that happens to creation and not to him. Yet he can add this property, so to speak, in generic language, without having any ontological change or having any problematic aspects of his simplicity. Versus something like me becoming old. That is where I have an intrinsic sort of property that's explaining this relation to age or whatever it is. So I tend to think that is what a real relation is in the very technical sense. And so when we start having these conversations, we often talk past one another because we will quickly move from a very technical sense of real relation to a non-technical sense of, well, God, it's crazy that God's not really related to the world. Does that make sense? I hope it does. Let me know your thoughts, questions, ideas in the comments below right now. Is this tracking with what you've thought? Is this explanation helpful? Am I being clear? I'm trying my best here to explain what I think is both a difficult concept, but also less difficult than it should be if we just understand sort of the context from which the debates are occurring. So there is a real sense in which there's this older metaphysical framework that's assumed that is not necessarily assumed in our current day. And so it causes these talking past one another. And so you got to get clear on what we're talking about and then not equivocate on the inferences that occur from God doesn't have any real relations in this really heavyweight sense to God doesn't have a relationship whatsoever. Really related is not identical to relationship. Okay. So those don't go together. You can have a relationship without being really related in these different senses. So hopefully that makes sense. I think there's a lot of confusion on this. What I'll tell you to do is read more, read Aquinas, read others, read some of these older metaphysics textbooks to try to get these categories in your mind, and to also understand that relations are not identical to distinctions. So that's a separate category. You know, that they're related, pun intended, to each other. One's a subcategory of the other, and yet they are not identical. So a relation isn't always going to be identical to a distinction, which I think most of the classical tradition are going to say, yes, there are real distinctions in God. There have to be real distinctions of some sort because you have three persons. If you don't have a real distinction, then you don't have a Trinity. So you've got to make distinctions, pun intended once again, between real relations and real distinctions. Those are not the same thing. They're different. So a lot of this sort of like really nuanced, tight metaphysical definitions and explanations, what happens is you have these older contexts, you have these older definitions, and they're not always translated, so to speak, into our contemporary idiom in ways that make sense. And then even if they are, what's appended are these invalid inferences to using similar terminology that doesn't relate to what the older terminology is supposed to be saying in any sense. So my recommendation typically is to, number one, yes, get acquainted with and master the older literature to understand truly what's going on, but also in most contexts, whether it's a debate or a discussion with somebody else, whether it's a church member or something, don't bring up this idea of real relations and the medieval sort of stuff. You don't need that. You can explain classical theism and the way that God is related to the world without recourse to these terms that I think can obfuscate, well, I said that poorly, that can make things less clear rather than more clear. Because when we're talking with whoever it may be, if we're debating somebody who is of like-minded sort of intellectual abilities, or we're talking to somebody who's a church member who has no idea what most of this stuff is going on, I still think it's wise to avoid some of these more technical debates. There is great value in them. I think there's extreme value in them, and they're necessary if you were to really engage in a lot of this literature. And yet it carries a significant, I don't know, a significant warning. No, that's not the right word. It carries just a significant potential for abuse. And so my general recommendation is to try to avoid that. Use terminology that's clearer, makes more sense, that's more agreed upon, and then you can make a lot of progress. Okay, that's my take here, briefly, quickly on real relations. Hopefully, it's helpful and useful. I do have a couple of other episodes that I've planned coming up. So if you're a loyal watcher and listener, as you know, I have been less consistent than I had been previously, where I was trying to do one a week, trying to get to at least 40 per year. That's still my goal, but I'm still a little bit shaky on getting them all done, just given different life circumstances and context. Trying to finish the dissertation, trying to finish this book that's supposed to come out, as well as adding on quite a lot of projects at the London Lyceum, which we're really excited about and value. But there's also the fact that a lot of the episodes I want to do here require a significant amount of labor and intensive time. So I'm going to list them right now. So if you're a loyal watcher or listener, go ahead and comment which one you want me to prioritize. So one of them, I thought about doing another episode on if there are different models of divine simplicity, or whether there's just one, sort of the identity thesis, and that's just it. So I have a chapter discussing this in the forthcoming book. So I'd be happy to do an episode on that at some point if you find that valuable. That's another topic that was unearthed in this debate between Gavin and Ryan. There's a couple of other things, though, I wanted to talk about. A episode on divine accommodation. What is that? And that's in part because I just finished reading, I finished reading probably 2 or 3 months ago, Peter Lightheart's book, Creator. And I have a review forthcoming on that soon. I'm making edits on that based on several reviewers' comments. But one of the key things that I think he gets wrong is the notion of divine accommodation. And so I think I might want to put together a positive explanation of what it is, what it isn't, to have a little bit of clarity there, because I think a lot of people misunderstand what accommodation is supposed to be doing and therefore cause problems down the road. 3 other things would be one on the nature and logic of congregationalism, and it would be a little bit of a response video, more of a response video than anything, though I'm trying to figure out how to make it not super long, because the video that I'm going to be responding to is like 90 minutes. And we all know we don't want a 3-hour response video. I'm not James White. Don't want to be James White. That's not my thing. But I think there is value in responding, hearing directly from others and responding directly to their claims. I do think that's valuable. So I'm trying to think of a way to somehow get that closer to like 40 or 45 minutes. That's still a lot for me, but I think that's more reasonable. Other episodes would be on divine violence. What do we do with the commands that God said to kill the Canaanites? Hopefully I can do that as a dual episode with me and Cody Float, but we'll see what happens. I might just try to go solo and just see what happens. And hopefully I'll come out alive. And then there's another one that I wanted to do on the nature of theological grifters. And, I've never said that out loud, that word. Maybe that's not how you pronounce it, but I'll pronounce it that way, and hopefully I got it right. But I wanted to talk about that, and I've got some old recordings to give you some examples of what that looks like. And yeah, so let me know if any of those sound legitimate or not legitimate. If any of those sound like I really want to listen to this, I've got other stuff. I guess I've got one on Eastern Orthodoxy that I'm responding to, sort of a video on Eastern Orthodoxy. That one's taking a little bit more time. So if any of those are high priority for you, drop a comment, tell me, and I'll make sure to try to prioritize those, because I plan to do them all. It's just a matter of when do I get to them all, whether it's in the next month or 2 or in the next year or 2. They're all on my list here, and I plan to do them. Anyway, I appreciate you all tuning in to Kiffin's Keep, and I look forward to talking with you all and thinking with you all.